Last week, National Public Radio CEO Catherine Maher became the center of headlines when social media posts and presentations she'd given emerged, which included expressing regret that the First Amendment prevents government censorship of, quote, misinformation on social media. Now, these comments came as NPR found itself also wrapped up in headlines surrounding their former journalist, Yuri Berliner, who publicly called out the news organization's left-wing bias. Here with his reporting on the drama surrounding NPR is Ben Johnson, senior reporter and editor at The Washington Stand. Ben, good to see you today.
Good to be with you, Joseph.
Well, let's first start off with Yuri Berliner, one-time NPR employee, longtime NPR employee, no longer with the organization. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah, he wrote an expose in something called The Free Press, which is headed by Barry Weiss, former New York Times reporter, where he talked about the overwhelming liberal bias of NPR. He said that this had been something that had just taken place essentially in the last few years since the advent of Donald Trump, and that he found increasingly that he was on the outs if he wanted to try and present a balanced story. After he published this, he was suspended for 5 days. And then when the head of NPR issued an email, he ended up ultimately resigning because he realized there would be no hope of returning journalistic ethics to NPR.
So with respect to NPR's response to Yuri Berliner's allegations, did they say that he's wrong about that, or that they just didn't like him pointing it out?
They didn't deny what he had to say, which would be impossible, essentially, given their track record, and particularly given the comments that Maher herself has made at various times. So instead, they simply shot the messenger.
Well, I referred in the opener to comments from Maher from the past that she was concerned about the freedoms protected by the First Amendment and how the First Amendment allowed, quote unquote, misinformation to be propagated around the internet. Are you surprised that she's concerned about what the First Amendment allows?
Ordinarily, journalists are quite concerned about what the First Amendment allows, generally in the idea that we should be maximizing our use of the First Amendment by publishing things, for example, that the government does not want heard. That's the true definition of journalism. Someone once said that anything that you're publishing the government wants published is simply you acting as a press agent. It's when you publish inconvenient truths that you're really acting as a journalist. But the idea that the First Amendment somehow constrains journalism or is a brake on government, that's sort of a new concern. Of course, these comments were made while she was executive director of the Wikipedia Foundation. There's no indication that she has changed since she is now head of the NPR. If anything, she's doubling down on the idea that, quote unquote, misinformation has no place on NPR. But who determines what's misinformation? As we've done multiple stories at the Washington Stand, for example, on fact checkers either getting it wrong or blatantly bringing narrative in as a condition of misinformation. The facts themselves should out, but they don't always, particularly when it comes to NPR coverage.
And that is, of course, the choice that our founders made. The First Amendment does allow people to say things that might not be true, that people might not like, that we might be offended by, but they had determined that the risk of a public square where people are free to say what they wish are smaller than the risk of a society where a government gets to determine for itself and for everyone else what is true and false and therefore what can be said. And clearly, she seems to be in disagreement with our founders, but I think significantly she's not the only person on the left to have said something like this lately. Ketanji Brown Jackson, who's on our Supreme Court, recently said during oral arguments that she was concerned that the First Amendment restrained the government's ability to protect people from misinformation, a very similar sentiment. But it's even more concerning when somebody on the Supreme Court expresses concern about the fact that the First Amendment restrains the government, when in fact the First Amendment was created for the explicit purpose of restraining the government from protecting our civil liberties. But Ben, how big of an issue is the fact that NPR is saying these things while being funded by taxpayer dollars to just be on the air?
Well, it's not even so much the fact that they're saying these things, it's that these things are in fact policy at NPR, and they filter down into the stories that people hear every day and that we're compelled to pay for with our tax dollars. Now, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting received more than $500 million last year, $525 million to be specific. Of that, about $119 million went to NPR, either through station affiliates or through programming. And NPR, by the way, always says that the federal government provides a small percentage of its budget. That's sort of like when Planned Parenthood says abortion is only 3% of its services. There are a lot of accounting tricks that are going on there. Right. In many cases, federal dollars go into other entities that then fund NPR. So it makes up a vast share of NPR's dollars. But then that impacts what ends up going out over the air. Of course, there are sort of highly woke stories about, for example, transgender individuals being involved in sort of Second Amendment training and militia activities. One of these went on the air not that long before the Nashville shooting. So these are the kinds of stories that they often focus on. But there is a massive left-wing bias, even an anti-Christian bias, quite candidly, in much of their reporting. And it's not even just their reporting. For example, they have a fairly comedic show called Wait, Wait, and Don't Tell Me. The host of that show in 2014 made fun of the crucifixion. There was an ad campaign showing a woman taking a selfie with Jesus, and she said, the host said that Jesus couldn't take the selfie because his hands were occupied. So mocking the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. The renowned NPR journalist Mara Liasson compared Antifa rioters to U.S. veterans storming Omaha Beach on D-Day. Morning Edition reporter Rachel Martin in 2018 referred to the quote-unquote so-called March for Life, although she later apologized. And these things really became official policy. In 2019, NPR had an official guidance reminder that no one should ever use the phrase the unborn because, and this is a quote from the guidance, babies are not babies until they're born.
Ben, in about 20 seconds, is funding, government funding for NPR something that we should expect to continue in perpetuity despite all of this?
It's something that never should have begun in the first place. There is no constitutional authorization for a government-sponsored news service. The Founding Fathers never envisioned anything like that. And thankfully, there's a bill to defund NPR that's just been introduced by Representative Bob Good of Virginia. He's following the footsteps of the late great conservative giant Congressman Phil Crane of Illinois, who regularly introduced bills to defund CPB back in the 1990s. So a lot of this is going forward, and I think that we can see we're going to defund NPR in the days to come.
I've got to cut you off. We are out of time, but thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.